Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Cookie and Trackers, Understanding the Technology and Regulatory Landscape. Let's jump into today's presentation. So we got a packed agenda for you. We're going to discuss the different types of online trackers and how they work. Update you on the regulatory landscape, as Christian mentioned, for ad tech and marketing, and also provide some considerations and best practices for managing online tracking technologies and vendors. So let's dive right into the different trackers and how they're being used. And when we think about them, the first thing that pops into mind are cookies. However, there are different types of technologies used along with or instead of cookies. So Adam, can you walk us through the different types of tracking technologies that
Yeah,
are commonly used and that DPOs need to be concerned with and what
yeah,
they're used for?
yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for that, Joanne. So, let's talk about four different types of online trackers. Now, when we think of online trackers, most commonly we are thinking of cookies. And I would almost say cookies are to trackers almost like what Hoovers are or used to be to vacuum cleaners in that sense. Cookies, they use essentially a cookie as a text file which sits on the browser. It can be used for a whole range of purposes. It can be used perhaps for to collect analytics data. It can be used. It can be used for things which we've written here, such as authentication. It can be used for personalization of ads. With cookies, they come in two broad types. We have what we call a third-party cookie, which would be a cookie dropped by a vendor other than the website that is being crawled, or we would have a first-party cookie, which we define as a cookie originating from the vendor, from the owner of the website. So that's cookies, the most commonly known type of tracker around. There are, of course, other types of online tracker. We have HTML5 storage, which is sometimes known as local storage, and these are used by web applications to store data locally on the browser so that maybe the next time the user visits that website, this data is already there, it loads up, and the experience is faster and altogether easier to use. This data would persist even after the user navigates away from the website, and it would be retrieved every time the user visits the website again. Another type of tracker are e-tags. These are often used to ensure that users are seeing the most recent version of a record and to check whether or not an update to the record which the user is seeing is actually needed. Again, the purpose here to track the user to ensure that the user sees the most recent version of the record. And then finally on this slide, we've got beacons, also known as clear pixels, also known as tracking pixels, and so on. These take the form of a clear graphic image delivered through the web browser as part of the web page request. Tiny, maybe 1 pixel image that sits somewhere on the web page. Similar to cookies, and often used in conjunction with cookies as part of a third-party tracking service. Where these web pixels or beacons are used is to build up profiles of user behavior. They can be used to do things such as ad impression counting and monitoring, things like campaign management. So that's a brief overview of the types of online trackers which are commonly used.
Going through the different trackers, what questions should DPO be asking their website development team or email distribution team to get the right answer to that question of what tracking have you built into the website or email?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how I'd answer that. I mean, really, what we're doing when we are either for new clients or existing clients, we are almost like answering that question for you. So rather than asking your teams what kind of trackers, are present on the website and what they're being used for. We would be crawling the client's websites, and I'll get onto good practices later on today, to identify the types of trackers, whether it's say cookies, beacons, etc., who they're from and what the purposes are and what the purposes are. So rather than asking your team what you've added, it'd be more like asking your technical account manager at TrustArc to arrange for a scan to identify and then classify those trackers.
All right, great. Thank you, Adam. And yeah, and let's dive into the regulatory landscape because I know Christian has a lot to share with us. And so, Christian, what are some of the key regulatory issues and trends you're seeing related to online tracking and the use of the types of tracking technologies that Adam just talked about?
Thanks, Joanne. So what I think I'd do, I thought I'd give everyone just a quick overview. Some people on the call will be fairly familiar with EU cookie law. Perhaps some of you are hearing this for the first time. And obviously then we'll look at some of the developments. We're also going to look at some of the US requirements coming down the line as well. So I guess the main driving force that has materialized, CMPs, concepts around trackers, issues of consent, and of various cases that I'm sure many of on the line are aware of, is predominantly came out of the back of EU cookie law. Particularly, the EU cookie law was first established in a fairly old piece of legislation, the ePrivacy Directive, which again has had a number of amendments, but effectively had its original state in 2002. For those who are familiar with the GDPR, they also may be aware that there was a plan to update the cookie law with a regulation to bring it aligned with the GDPR, and there was intended to be passed at the same time when the GDPR came into force in 2018. That legislation never passed, so in many cases we have two separate pieces of law. Some member states have done work to reconcile them, but we effectively have two separate pieces of law when we approach privacy and MarTech, AdTech in the EU. We have the cookie law and we have the GDPR. Breach of the cookie law, I suppose, why is this important, at least from a legal and a risk perspective? For those who are familiar with the GDPR fines, well, the vast majority of member states, with the notable exception of the United Kingdom, now we're obviously not part of the EU, but we have exactly the same law. Most countries have adapted and aligned compliance and fining under their cookie law to that of the GDPR. So the greater of 17.5 million pounds, 20 million euros, or 4% of worldwide turnover, whichever is greater. So the fines are substantial for breaching cookie law. So what is cookie law? Well, the baseline, and I've put it there below. The baseline position is that any person, this is a business in this context, shan't store or gain access to information stored on terminal equipment of a subscriber unless requirements are made. The requirement being that their individual has clear and comprehensive information about the means and purposes of that storage and what that information will be used for, and that they give their consent. Now, there are many exemptions and caveats to that, which we'll go on to, but effectively, you need consent for cookies. The last thing to bear in mind is I mentioned that this attempt, shall we say, to bring in and amend and update cookie law around the same time as the GDPR. Well, even that has not happened. There is a significant degree of jurisprudence which deals with the interplay between the ePrivacy Directive and the GDPR. The key issues for the compliance professionals on the line to be aware of is that point one, consent under cookie law, which was never consent as we understand consent under the GDPR, given that we're dealing with a 2002 law, is now the GDPR test for consent. So that's specific and informed and unambiguous intentions of the user. The second point to bear in mind is when we're dealing with personal data in the EU, we talk about the lawful basis for processing. A business regulated in the GDPR needs to have a reason, a lawful reason for processing that data. Many businesses are very familiar with legitimate interests. Others will be familiar with consent. Well, the line is where, because consent is required for the purpose of cookies, the interplay between the two is that if you have consent under the PECAs or the ePrivacy Directive, you also need to have consent under the GDPR, which has caused quite a lot of issues. And we've had a series of cases around whether legitimate interests can work hand in hand with the use of cookies. But the current line that the regulators take at the moment is it is consent. So how does that materialize? How does that manifest itself in what a cookie pop-up looks like, and what is it trying to gain? So effectively, the position is you must obtain consent from the user for any non-essential or non-strictly necessary, depending on which language you use, non-essential cookies. Typical types being cookies that are used for analytical purposes, cookies that are used for targeting and marketing purposes, cookies that are used to allow social media plugins, for example. You need to tell individuals that you are using cookies and what cookies you're using. That extends and includes strictly necessary cookies and session cookies. For those who are aware, session cookies are not subject to the consent requirements. Strictly necessary cookies. What is a strictly necessary cookie? Well, the typical view is a strictly necessary cookie or essential cookie is any cookie that is used either to deliver a service specifically requested by the user, or it's part of that overarching operation of your website. That includes things like load balancing cookies, cookies that are designed for integrity or to allow access to secure parts of the website, and fundamentally, the cookie that remembers someone's cookie preferences. You don't need consent for those types of cookies. It goes without saying that regulators in the EU are very adamant that cookies should not be dropped unless an interaction with the banner has been made, effectively, unless someone has said, yes, I want this. And consent management platforms, and I know we've obviously got the TrustArc folks on the line to kind of give an overview of what that looks like. The regulators with regards to CMPs, there's clearly been a lot of harmonization around what CMPs do, and the users are starting to understand, the consumers are starting to understand more about CMPs. Regulators make it very clear that the CMP module and the functionality available under a CMP to allow a user to determine their choices, that needs to be clearly signposted on a website. The last two things to mention around consent capture is around the accept all button. I've seen many consent banners through my advice with clients, and it always comes up, well, do we need to have a reject all? Do we need to have a refuse all? There are many different approaches out there. All I can say is that the enforcement action, the regulatory scrutiny, as it suggests, says that if you have an accept all, you should have a refuse all. And there are just a couple of fines, and they are fairly punchy fines for the EU. And there are others of where that has specifically been a finable point within a case brought by a regulator. Those particular cases with a French regulator. And the last thing to bear in mind is the EU, particularly with its latest legislation geared on consumer protection, which I'll mention briefly, and I think Pape on the line is going to talk about a Google manifestation of some of this consumer legislation. There is this concept of what we call dark patterns or nudge tactics. This is the aim of designing your banner or designing your UI in such a way as to solicit a response that maybe benefits you, but not necessarily benefits the user. Classic example being you put accept in green and you put reject in red, for example. The European regulators have wisened up to this habit. And to be clear, anything that can be construed as clearly a dark pattern or a nudge tactic is unlikely to be compliant. That being said, this aspect of A/B testing to determine what necessarily may give you your best subscription opt-in rate, that is not necessarily frowned upon, as long as, again, what you're doing is not necessarily a dark pattern. Next slide, Joanne. So what's coming down the line? So I'm going to whiz through this slide because there's quite a lot of detail here behind the bullets, but effectively there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny, unsurprisingly, around personalized marketing and targeting activities at the moment. The position being that, at least in the entire ad tech stack, from publisher all the way through to advertiser, there really isn't an excuse, as the regulators would say, for getting your cookie banner, your use of cookies, your compliance around cookies in order. We've had some significant cases recently. We had a case, the Meta case, as we call it, which put to bed that position that I said around, can you rely on legitimate interests versus consent? It's consent. We had a large fine against a very notable ad tech provider that was specifically around the onus that if you are we're talking about third-party cookies. If you are asking or requesting a website to put cookies to place a cookie on your behalf, you still have an obligation to ensure that they get the consent on your behalf. And there was a final decision there. And for those who are familiar with IAB's TCF, the Transparency Consent Framework, very, very popular for IAB members and certain ad tech powered bidding. Again, we had some tweaks to how the IAB consent framework works. Again, predominantly moving certain legitimate interest-based options to consent. I mentioned dark patterns. Well, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, for those who are not familiar, that is it's not a super regulator, but it's effectively a body that makes up all of the respective privacy authorities in the EU. They publish guidance. We call it guidance, but it's effectively writ. And they had a task force not too long ago, last year, if I recall, where they basically looked at cookie banners and cookie practices. They talk about dark patterns in there quite a lot. That will give you, there's a lot of guidance in there around what they expect certain approaches to be cookies, where do you draw the line between what is a strictly necessary cookie and what isn't. And regulatory action has really started to kind of cascade down as regulators have really started to kind of get a handle on cookies and CMPs particularly. So obviously there is quite a lot of non-government organizational action. For those who are familiar with Max Schrems and his organization, None of Your Business, NOIB, there's been quite a lot of NGO-led action, usually targeting larger websites around their cookie compliance practices. But even in the UK, in my home jurisdiction, our regulator, the ICO, issued what it called the Cookie Challenge, effectively going through the Alexa rankings, what are the top 100 websites, sending out compliance letters to them, moving on to the next, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of scrutiny that's starting to ramp up in the EU. The other thing I mentioned is about websites. So there's often this aspect of, particularly in a third-party cookie scenario, where a website or a publisher, as we would call them, goes, well, I'm not necessarily responsible for how this particular pixel works or what happens to my data. I'm somewhat at the behest of the ad tech vendor. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, at least in the eyes of the regulator. We had very recently a fine in Sweden. A large pharmaceutical company was fined around 3.5 million, so a smaller fine, but they were fined through basically for passing data to Meta without appropriate consent, irrespective of whether they knew or had control of what Meta was or wasn't doing with the data. So the point is the compliance and the exposure hits at all parts of the ad tech chain. And then the last thing to probably mention is I mentioned this consumer piece of legislation coming down the line. We have what's called the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. So again, acknowledging that the ad tech space is made up of quite a large number of big tech players, particularly some of the large platforms. And we're great to have Pape on the line to talk from the Google side. What the regulator is looking to do is, from a consumer perspective, is to bake in some of these privacy requirements straight into that legislation itself. So basically forcing the online platforms to almost ensure that the customers it contracts with are all playing by the same rules. So again, Pape may talk about a manifestation of that, but we have the DMA. I'm going to move on now, Joanne, if that's okay. So that's the EU. And if you asked me a couple of years ago what the US was doing about this, so I have lots of US clients, and they particularly ask, well, do we need to worry about what we're doing on the US? And if we asked about this a few years ago, generally there's not that much to talk about. Things have happened very thick and fast over the last couple of years. So while we still don't have a comprehensive federal privacy framework in the US, not one that we would call comprehensive anyway. US state privacy is really beginning to ramp up. We have multiple states now that have their own US privacy laws, either in force or in the process of entering into force. The US state privacy treats cookies slightly different to we do in the EU. I mentioned that cookies are a separate set of law to the GDPR. You need not to have personal data within a particular cookie for it to draw the consent requirements. Well, cookies themselves in many state privacy legislation are specifically regulated as a class. So for California, they are one of the specific regulated class of personal information. The US, even though it takes a very similar approach to the EU in terms of the information that must be given, but it's what we would call an opt-out regime. So typically, it requires the ability for individuals to opt out or exercise their rights to say no. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get their consent, their active consent up front. And for those who are familiar with some of the regulations around the sale of data, it manifests itself in lots of different ways in different member states, obviously California being the most famous in the do not sell. A sale of data typically means any passing of, well, typically the cookie scenario will involve any passage of data between two websites or a website and an advertiser, or a website and an ad exchange for targeting and marketing purposes. They typically meet the test for what is a sale. Other thing to maybe point out in the US is use of geolocation data. So the US has some very specific rules around tracking, and particularly accurate use of accurate information for geolocation tracking. Again, when you apply that in the context of a targeting or retargeting activity, the rules are almost similar to what we have in the EU. You're almost moving over into an opt-in regime in that particular instance. The penultimate thing to mention is this concept of what we call an universal opt-out mechanism. Effectively, again, something that I've always been asked from the EU sector is technically not actually compliant in the EU, but this concept around dealing with death by cookie pop-ups. Some of the US regulators have kind of caught on to this and thought, well, if someone could interact with a single plugin in their banner and send a signal out to all of the websites that they land on, what they do not want or what they do want, wouldn't that be great? And that's what's born out of the universal opt-out mechanism. This is seen as quite a popular thing by many of the states, and they all will, either California, which already has this in place, or most from 2025 onwards. I think Texas is the first to come down the line, if memory serves, will mandate that websites have to basically respond to universal opt-out signals. So effectively, if someone is using a plugin on their browser, you as a website need to respond to those signals. And then I mentioned litigation in the EU. Well, I think you can't really talk about US legislative developments without talking about litigation, predominantly given that new regulatory regimes tend to move leaps and bounds in the US through civil rights actions, particularly. We've had a whole range of class actions come out of the US on the birth of some of these US state privacy laws. One particular interest one is the more recent class actions of using somewhat fairly legacy wiretapping laws. I think there are class actions in multiple states, the major ones being California, New York, Washington, Illinois particularly. But just to kind of pick on California, for example, under their existing wiretap laws, you need to have permission or consent, opt-in consent to be able to record a conversation between two parties that you are not a party to. Some creative lawyers in the US have extended that into does that not also cover the use of trackers and pixels? With varying success in the courts, but it's very interesting in showing where the exposure and the pressure comes from. The argument is, if some of these cases do prove successful, the question is whether the US does actually move to an opt-in regime, similar to what we have in the EU. Next slide, Joanne. So that was a lot of information. So I guess bringing it together, what would I say if you're a lawyer or a compliance officer or a a chief marketing officer or someone responsible for managing your digital estate? What kind of questions? What are your key takeaways to kind of de-risk yourself from what is a lot of legislation either in force or coming down the line? It's not a marketing spiel. I know we're on a TrustArc conference, but I tell all clients it's almost impossible to do this stuff these days without having a CMP, and a CMP that actually is developing and keeping abreast with all this legislation coming down the line. No one wants to implement a CMP on your website only to find out opt-out mechanisms come in 2025 and your CMP is not aligned with that. That's not going to be great for you. There is a lot of argument that you can bundle jurisdictions by common requirements, most common one being opt-outs together and opt-ins together, for example. And you can use geolocation rules for those CMPs that support geolocation rules, you can use geolocation to basically apply the right approach based on the IP address of or the location of your website that it's targeting, or the location of the individual visiting your website. Another thing to bear in mind is considering your interplay for those who use tag managers. It's quite common that I will do cookie compliance projects for clients. We'll get the CMP in great order. Everything looks great optically, but because they're using the tag managers to actually manage the consent signal, there's not an alignment there. So actually, you're not actually doing what your banner is saying that you're doing, or your CMP is saying you're doing. So very important to ensure there's an aligned approach between tag managers and CMPs. Harmonizing privacy and cookie notices. As privacy lawyers, we live and breathe this stuff, but effectively, there's a lot to say that a lot of these laws, a lot of these requirements are pretty ubiquitous depending on the jurisdiction that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of saying that you can just simply harmonize some of this language within, particularly your cookie notice, but also I've seen it done within privacy notices too. And then I think the last three are pretty kind of straightforward, but often missed. Do your due diligence on your vendors, that's your ad tech providers, and your CMPs. Ask them the right question, ensuring that they've got the capability to support your needs. Audit your third-party providers. This argument of getting consent on behalf of someone else to do something with the data, are they actually doing what they're saying they're doing? Are they doing something else? And then education. Education is quite an important one. I often have calls with clients where some of this is all new to them. Understanding that this exposure does exist, understanding that not everything is always plain sailing is going to be really important to kind of help you de-risk yourself. Joanne, I think that's me.
All right, thank you, Christian. That is definitely a lot to take in. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. And it really, highlights the importance of some of the best practices that Adam's going to talk about. But first, really diving into what does that mean from a practical implementation perspective, getting that consent for the tracking, how does that work through a cookie consent manager? So Adam, you want to take us through how cookie consent managers work, and then also, how they work in conjunction with a tag manager solution?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for this, Joanne. So, how does Consent Manager work? So, if we were to look at a website with Consent Manager, e.g. our very own TrustArc.com. So, the user's visiting the website, and Consent Manager is straight away asking two questions. First question, is this user in a region of the world where consent is needed, such as the GDPR region, such as possibly the state of California? That's question one. Question two, is this user somebody who has entered their preferences on this website before? And if the question about the region, the answer is yes, this user is in a region where consent is needed. And the answer to question two, is this user a new visitor? Then if that's yes as well, then Consent Manager will show, albeit with a suitable message for the user, for that user based on the region they're in. So message one can be shown for maybe the GDPR region, and message two can be shown for, say, California. Now, the user sees this message, and now they will interact with Consent Manager to enter their preferences. Now, once the user's made their preferences, a few things will happen. If the user is opting out of trackers, if they are not integrated with a tag management tool, then we're going to be calling the vendor opt-outs where they exist for the trackers that the user has opted out of. Where the user has integrated with a tag management tool, we are calling firing rules within the tag management tool to ask it to bring back trackers that the user's consented to, which meet those firing rules. And once the call has been made, then the user is now going to see trackers on their browser which correspond to what they've consented to a brief time ago. And also, TrustArc are dropping trackers on the user's browser to record their preferences, which means that the next time the user visits this website, they will see content which is based on the preferences they previously entered. And these preferences will last either until the user updates their preferences or until the user's consent expires if they do nothing else. And that consent typically lasts around 6 months. I think 6 months is our recommended duration for consent at TrustArc. So I've given everybody a brief overview of how Consent Manager works, and I believe that slide which I shared, it will be available after today's call, and it's available in the onboarding documentation that is typically shared with new consent clients at TrustArc. Let's move on to talking about good practice for for keeping Consent Manager up to date for managing online trackers. And the guidance which I've written here, this is based on TrustArc's recommendations in our support portal. It's based on it's based on what my clients do. It's recommendations which I would give to my clients. First thing I advise clients to do is to review their scans regularly. TrustArc clients in most cases are getting scans of their websites to identify and classify all the trackers found on a monthly or quarterly basis. Now, these scans show not only the trackers, but also how they've arrived there. And the questions which I'm looking for my clients to respond to are these. Are the trackers which you found in your scans those which you are expecting to be present, firstly? Second question, are they classified correctly, whether you are using TrustArc's default classification or whether you are using a custom classification which has moved away from standard? Ultimately, the goal of the scan is to give the client an accurate, an up-to-date list of trackers, which then gets loaded into Consent Manager so that when the website user visits your website, they are given an accurate list of all the trackers found on your website together with their purposes. And this will help your website users make an informed choice about what they're consenting to should they choose to do so. So that's the first recommendation, just making sure that you set time aside to review your scans on a regular basis throughout the year. A recommendation that all technical account managers at TrustArc do make is that we recommend an integration between Consent Manager and a tag management tool, such as and there are several on the market. If a client is signed up for a managed service with TrustArc, the technical account manager is there to help you integrate Consent Manager with a tag management tool if you do struggle, though guidance is also provided. A few benefits of integrating Consent Manager with a tag management tool. There's an obvious usability benefit in that simply the consent experience is a whole lot faster because we're making a single call to the tag management tool, getting a single response back, so it's faster. And also, from a usability perspective, users can update their preferences at any time without clearing all the cookies on their browser. So it just means a nicer user experience. From a compliance perspective, integrating with a tag management tool allows clients to achieve what we call zero tracker load. And by zero tracker load, we mean only required trackers loading before the user gives their consent. And this is zero tracker load is a recommendation for compliance with several sets of privacy laws around the world. So we recommend not only do clients integrate Consent Manager with a tag management tool, but as per my comment about reviewing scans, it is also my recommendation that the tag management tool integration is reviewed on a regular basis, because we expect our clients to be adding trackers on frequently to their websites. They need to make sure that these new trackers which they've added have suitable firing rules applied so that The only trackers which are loading before consent are those which are deemed as required, essential for the operation of the website. A third recommendation, which I would recommend to clients, is a tool implementing something which we call TrustArc, which we call AutoBlock. This is something which we've had at TrustArc for around 2 years. AutoBlock can be used either as a standalone tool to achieve zero tracker load, or it can be used as alongside a tag management tool to achieve zero tracker load. And certainly for large clients, the benefit of AutoBlock is that it can be used as a safety net to catch those trackers which you haven't already applied suitable firing rules to, and that makes it particularly useful maybe in large decentralized organizations where different branches of the company have got responsibility for different websites. As with my comments about scans, AutoBlock does depend on regular reviews of the scan. One of the things that AutoBlock will do is when it's checking a website, it will check to see if a tracker is actually inside of Consent Manager and what its classification is, so it knows whether or not it needs to block it. So with that in mind, if a client does want to use AutoBlock, they would need to make sure that they were regularly reviewing their scans, regularly sharing feedback on those scans with their technical account manager, so that even if they maybe weren't able for whatever reason to apply suitable firing rules to a tracker, AutoBlock could catch it, pick it up, and prevent it from loading before the user gives their consent. So these are 3 good practices which I would recommend to all consent clients, and these are all things which your technical account manager at TrustArc can certainly help you with. Joanne, back to you.
Thank you, Adam. This sounds like a great way for DPOs to trust but verify what they're told by their web developers. Would you say that, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would always, and I think this takes us back to the poll which we had right at the start of the session, who's responsible for compliance, and we said multiple teams, and I think that tallies in with that, and I think this is something compliance needs to be managed both by the DPO, by the web developers, by the whole team. So this process of reviewing, working together to deploy trackers, it's got to be a team effort for the business.
Okay, great. And we do have one question from our audience around cookies and trackers. They get the most attention. Are you seeing from a regulatory perspective or anything? Christian, this is something you can weigh in as well. On mobile apps with analytics or ads SDKs?
So I think first of all, it goes without saying that the mobile digital ecosystem is not immune from these rules as well. Access to known device identifiers, particularly on Apple iOS and Android based devices, are all subject to the rules, as are SDKs. The simple answer is there is a lot of regulatory scrutiny in this space. There was a very recent fine in Norway, particularly, and there's currently active investigations against a number of ad tech providers specifically with regards to the use of mobile captures data. However, the other thing to bear in mind here is that with the advent of the Digital Markets Act, at least the 2 core operating systems, Android and iOS, are within the framework of that legislation. And as I mentioned, there is a drive under that legislation for the platforms themselves to basically ensure that consumers or customers that they're contracting with are almost forced down a pathway to ensure that they are compliant. It's almost we need to mark a little bit of your homework to ensure that we are all complying with our own rules as well. So in that area, we may see perhaps a little bit less regulatory scrutiny, particularly if the regulators are satisfied with what that approach looks like. But the short answer is none of this is immune from the mobile space. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Christian. Let's go ahead and transition things over to Pape, who will now talk about Google's consent mode. So we'll hand it over to you.
So yeah, as I was mentioning before, I've been working with the CMPs for the past 4 years, including TrustArc. It's been quite a great partnership. We've enjoyed working with them quite a lot. And yeah, so today I'll be focusing my presentation on 3 main topics. The first one are the shifts that are happening in the ads ecosystem. Then the second one is about the role that Google solution is taking or are taking in this context. And finally, how CMPs such as TrustArc can support our customers in implementing our solutions in a more seamless way. So first of all, I think there's no doubt, and we've already touched upon it today, that the advertising space is going through some very important shifts. Actually, these shifts are so important that some people are talking about like a change of paradigm. And it's mostly because we're shifting from a deterministic to a probabilistic system. What does it mean in the end? Like, so what your marketing teams may have faced is a reduction in the amount of observable data, right? And because of several factors and drivers that I'll mention later, the industry and Google has had to rely a bit more on AI-based solutions to support your team in reaching their goals in terms of audience targeting and ads performance. And how do we do that? By modeling what's observable and deducing from it what is not observable anymore. So we're relying quite a lot on modeling. But in order to do that, we need to have very solid foundations. How do we get these solid foundations? So the first aspect of it is that we need to rely on first-party data, right? Which is the type of data that you as an advertiser or your company as an advertiser get directly from the users that are basically using your services. These solutions are based on AI and depend much less on trackers. But more than anything else, this data must be of quality and, of course, consented, which is in line with our responsible approach to data collection. So to summarize, the future is consented, it's first party, and it's modeled. So now I'm going to dwell a little bit more on the key drivers of this shift or this change in paradigm. First of all, and at its core, they are the user's expectations. They have evolved like over the past 10, 15, 20 years, right? And so users are desiring more transparency and control. But at the same time, and probably on the back of it, the regulators' work has also like dramatically changed. And Christian touched upon it before. By creating a framework for more transparency and control over the use of the data, but also like over the destination of that data. And finally, like the tech platforms, such as Google, have made some changes as well to take into account both aspects that I've already mentioned, which means like the user's expectations, but also like the legal framework. And platforms like ours have actually set restrictions to the traditional way data is collected, right? So we have been making some product upgrades throughout 2024, and to be honest, like it's been much longer. I started at Google like maybe 4 years ago, and I started working right away on ads privacy products, and there were like a couple of them at that time, and now we have many more. But some of these upgrades that we've made throughout 2024 will require your action if you haven't done anything yet. And I'll get into that right now. So what are the 4 steps that you need to take? First, you should make sure that you're collecting consent in line with the legal requirements applicable in your country. And Christian already touched upon that. But also Google's consent policy. So we've created a policy that is reflecting quite a body of regulatory work, and it's called the European Union User Consent Policy. And if you need to set up, let's say, a consent notice, we highly recommend, and again, like it was mentioned by Christian, but also Adam, we highly recommend that you work with a CMP. It's going to be done in a much more seamless way, and you'll also have like several types of options that may satisfy you or fit much better with your needs. Second, you should set consent mode, and I'll explain later what it is, but like very simply, consent mode is an API that we've set that enables us to adjust the behavior of our tag based on the level of consent that is provided by the end user. So we launched consent mode about 4 years ago, so when I started at Google, actually. But we've also updated consent mode. And so we released a second version of it, and if I do remember well, it was in December last year, that we recommend that you implement for audience cases like remarketing. And also Christian touched upon it, but like we at least require it not only for web, but also for apps. Third, if you are using our analytics tools, we highly recommend that you use GA4. And fourth, for those using APIs to share offline data with Google, we recommend that you update the code to communicate the consent signal to Google in order to avoid losing offline audience such as customer match. Now, our work with the CMPs like TrustArc. Again, about 2 years ago, we created a CMP partner program, right? And we have been working with the CMPs such as TrustArc so that they actually create native integrations of consent mode so that it's much more seamless for you to adopt consent mode. We had made like some studies and we realized that if a customer was to implement consent mode on their own, it would take them like much more time than doing it like through a CMP. So we highly recommend that you do it with a CMP. The other advantage of working with CMP is that they will also help you out with like setting up your consent banner, as I mentioned it before. There are other advantages with working with a CMP, and that's related to first the robustness and reliability of the integrations that they've made, right? And that's also coupled with like their technical support, right? So if you're facing any issues with the integrations, the Google product integrations, but also like any other aspects of like the work that you're doing with the CMPs, you can actually reach out to their customer support. All that, at least in as far as our program is concerned, has been vetted by our technical team as well. So we've worked very, very closely with companies such as TrustArc in making sure that like the solutions that we're offering, at least as far as Google is concerned, are as reliable as possible, as well as the customer support, of course. Now, let's talk a little bit about like consent mode. Consent mode is really at the heart of our EU UCP, the European Union User Consent Policy that I mentioned before, right? We think that first you should definitely have like a consent banner that is, as I said, in line with your local regulations or the regulations that are applicable to your case, but also that you use consent mode. I already described it again. Already described what consent mode is, but like again, it's an API that enables you to communicate the level of consent provided by the end users for the use of trackers to us, so that then we adjust our tags accordingly. All that on the basis of the choice that you've made on the consent notice or banner. And we will respect the user's choice. That's the idea. That's like what is really powerful with consent mode, at least for us. And then depending on the choice that has been made, the data will be collected or not. And on that basis, the data collected will be modeled. And it goes back to one of the first points that I've made before. And then you can get an idea of your model conversions in your report. We estimate, it's just like an estimate, that on average, might be higher, it might be lower, 65% of at-click to conversion journeys lost due to unconsented users are actually recovered through consent mode. So that's like a very high value proposition of consent mode. As I mentioned before, we used to have like consent mode V1, if I may say, that was launched back in 2020, July 2020. And we now have like a second version of consent mode. I'll walk you through like the differences between the two. Essentially, is that we added like 2 new parameters onto the new version, so that like you have a bit more control over some of the things that you can do when it comes to the ads usage. But originally we had like 2 parameters, the analytics one and the ad storage one. As their name indicates, they were like to control like the use of cookies for these purposes, analytics and ad storage. We added 2 new parameters onto the new version of consent mode. One that is called ad user data, that adds a little bit more of control over what you could do before with ad storage. So second layer of it. And then another parameter that is like ad personalization, that controls whether personalized advertising can be enabled or not. That is it for me. I think we are on time. Thanks a lot for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and then we can probably like set up something, or I'll guide you to the right person, POC within Google.
All right, great. Thank you, Pape. Really appreciate you walking us through that. I think we have time for just one quick question. I know we're coming at the top of the hour. Christian, what are some resources you recommend for education, as you outlined that is one of the key things compliance folks should be doing within their organization?
So that's a really good question in terms of education. So I think first of all, particularly if you've partnered with a CMP, there's typically decent education resources that your CMP will make available to you. The reason why I'd say that, again, nothing to do with being on a TrustArc panel. It's just simply been that you want education, not just from the legal perspective, but how do you actually play around with the functionality available to you to conform with that. So that education will be much more tailored to the CMP of your choosing. So that's always a good starting point. The other places that I usually point clients to are, particularly as things are going, many of the regulators now have started to produce pretty decent guidance in a much more, should we say, usable friendly form. I wouldn't necessarily recommend for a starter for 10 reading EDPB guidance. EDPB guidance is great if you're a privacy professional. It's fairly detailed, but some of the guidance that's been put out by the French regulator, for example, the CNIL, is good. I always punt for my home regulator. The ICO has some good information around cookies and what can and can't be used, particularly in respect to marketing strategies. And then last but not least, it's often beneficial for your own user created content. So again, how you adapt with your vendors, how you adapt with your partners. Everyone has a slightly different ad tech stack. They don't always necessarily look the same. And that often suggests that you might want to create something curated at your side, either with assistance of your advisors, of your partners, or of your compliance counsel. So there's always a benefit in something user created as well.
Great. Thanks, Christian. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank Adam, Christian, and Pape for providing our audience with a lot of great information here today. So thank you.